This is the first gas-powered automobile ever created, the Benz Motor Car No. 1. This car was made by Carl Benz in 1886. Benz submitted the first patents for spark plugs, gear shifters, and other things that make an automobile an automobile. All of this occurred during the time of an industrial and transportation explosion. Since its creation, the automobile has been seen throughout history as the pinnacle of typical transportation. It enabled faster and easier travel and transportation for people and resources, and it was favored by the working class because it made their jobs easier. Accessibility and affordability for most was a problem, until the early 1900s when Henry Ford and his Model T came along, during the time of social, political, and economic reform known as the Progressive Era. Henry Ford was born on July 30, 1863 in Greenfield Township, Michigan. As a child, Ford's father told Henry that he wanted him to take over the family farm. However, Ford had bigger dreams and left the farm at the age of 16, taking an apprenticeship as an engineer at a shipbuilding firm in Detroit. 3 years later, he began working for the Edison Illuminating Company. While working at the Edison Illuminating Company, Ford, during his shifts, began developing plans for a horseless carriage, and in 1896 he constructed his first model, the Ford Quadricycle. That same year, Ford had a meeting with Edison and his executives. He presented his thoughts on the automobile, looking for their opinion on his work. Edison encouraged him to create a better model, and Henry took his advice. Ford, after a few attempts at perfecting cars and starting companies, founded the Ford Motor Company in 1903, later innovating the moving assembly line process. The Ford Company shaped the automobile industry by creating the assembly line, which made the car more affordable and opened more jobs for unskilled labor. But workers were doing repetitive work, and the lack of variation of cars set him back. Ford named his models in the order of the alphabet, starting with the Model A in 1903. It was an 8-horsepower, 2-to-4-seater roadster. 1,750 were made from 1903 to 1904. The pattern continued with a high-end Model B and a modern and lower-cost Model C. Several letters were skipped, some failed concepts and others just experimental designs. The next successful model was the Model F, a larger and more luxurious development of the Model A and C. From 1906 to 1908, Ford released the models N, R, and S, similar cars with obvious external body differences. The Model T was released on October 1, 1908, the first model that was developed through the moving assembly line. This helped the Model T become the most popular and favorable model for the common middle class. In 1908, the Model T was released and known as the Model T 1909. The Model T was the first car model to have year variants. The car also came in versions with more back seats and doors that would cost more, usually by $30 to $200. The car was made out of roughly 5,000 parts. All models from 1914 and onward were only manufactured in the color black. The Model T was also the first car to be simultaneously manufactured on a global scale. It was being produced in the US, Canada, Britain, Germany, Argentina, France, Spain, Norway, Belgium, Brazil, Mexico, and Japan by 1925. The Model T 1915 edition had a 10-gallon tank and had roughly 20 miles per gallon. December 1, 1913, Henry Ford implemented the first moving assembly line in his factories. The assembly line increased productivity by making work unskilled. Workers in the assembly line did very repetitive work, doing things the same way over and over again. Eventually, they became extremely fast at it, and that increased productivity as well. Because of this, the time it took to assemble a car from beginning to end went from 12 hours to 2 hours and a half. Charles Sorensen, a principal of Ford, explains the process of assembling a car in 1956.
We did this simply by putting the frame on skids, hitching a tow rope to the front end, and pulling the frame along until axles and wheels were put on. Then we rolled the chassis along the notches to prove it could be done. While demonstrating this moving line, we worked on some of the sub-assemblies, such as completing a radiator with all of its hose fittings so that we could place it very quickly on the chassis. We also did this with the dash and mounted the steering gear and spark coil.
Before the assembly line, a small group of skilled workers would work the steps and parts individually, taking them about 12 hours to make a car. But after the assembly line, workers would work on a specific area and the cars would move in a line, making production much faster and efficient. This allowed more cars to be produced per day, which made them cheaper and more affordable for the middle class. The Ford assembly line shaped the car industry primarily by making automobiles accessible to the middle class. Henry Ford was different from other car makers because he targeted middle-class consumers, unlike his competitors who focused on the upper class.
Actually, it took 4 years and more to develop the Model T. Previous models were the guinea pigs, one might say, for experimentation and development of a car which would realize Henry Ford's dream of a car which anyone could afford to buy, which anyone could drive anywhere, and which almost anyone could keep in repair.
He was able to do that successfully by simplifying and standardizing his cars. The Model T was launched in 1908 for around $800 depending on the version, where previous cars in 1907 would cost $2,000 to $3,000. As time went on, in 1910s and the early 1920s, the price would gradually decrease to under $300 by 1924.
Obviously, Henry Ford, if his workers worked 3 or more years, he would offer $5 per day, which back then was a lot. Doesn't seem like a lot now, but it is. And the Gilded Age, even though it wasn't in the Gilded Age, there's still a lot of unions left over in the Progressive Era. Even though the Progressive Era eliminated a lot of unions, there were still some for factory workers, which his workers were doing, making cars. It was still very dangerous. So to keep the unions away and from his workers not joining the unions, he was offer that $5 per day over the 3 years. So in those 3 years, they wouldn't join a union, and they would get $5 after those 3 years. So he really liked to keep his same workers and just let them keep working for him, and he did that with a smart strategy so they wouldn't join the unions.
Ford would increase the pay to $5 per day for workers who had been with him for 3 or more years, encouraging them to continue working at his company. This was a huge step at the time, where his competitors would only pay $2 to $3 per day. Ford also put car factories in 6 continents, where each factory made the same cars using the same techniques. 57% of cars purchased in 1921 were from Ford's company, dominating the market and globalizing the car industry to what it is today. Ford's automobile company succeeded in these various ways, but it also had its failures. In 1927, Ford stopped manufacturing the Model T and started to introduce the new Model A. The Model A car had higher horsepower and better brakes, among other improvements. By that time, the Ford company had produced over 15 million Model Ts, and the Ford Motor Company was the largest automobile manufacturer in the world. However, the Model A was not successful and turned out to be a disappointment for the company. The car was outsold by both the Chevrolet, made by General Motors, and the Plymouth, made by Chrysler. The car had to be discontinued in 1931. One of the fallbacks of the assembly line process was that workers found it to be boring compared to assembling the cars prior. This was because they would now stand in the same spot for hours, repeating the same steps hundreds of times per day. Henry Ford's business succeeded and failed in various different ways, but people have learned from him what works and what doesn't. Automobile industries today still follow his example. Today, when manufacturing cars, assembly lines are still used. The main difference is that today, most parts of the assembly process are done by robots, with humans doing the more detailed parts of the assembly process. Thanks to the help of these robots, automobile industries can build various different model cars and not repeat Ford's mistake of only manufacturing one model car. This is how we have learned from the Ford Automobile Company.